Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I enthusiastically support this measure and encourage you to do so as well. I want to begin by thanking Chairman Welch for his hard work on this. It's been an issue that I've followed for some time globally, the issue of child marriage, but last summer it was brought to my attention by an advocate, and we took a hard look at the issue here in Georgia, and I filed an Open Records Act request to the Georgia Department of Public Health, and we received data back. Georgia does not publicly report marriage license data, but through this Open Records Act request, we received data from the time period of 2000 to 2015, and we learned that 10,000 children were married in Georgia during that time period. In recent years, about 200 to 225 children have been married each year in Georgia. About 25% of those are age 16, which this change would then prohibit, and about 75% are age 17. And this law strengthens our current procedures for those who would be 17 years old. I support this bill for several reasons. One, children are vulnerable and they have limited options to protect themselves because they lack the rights of an adult in our judicial system. Child marriages compromise girls' futures and their families' futures. And it's important that both parties to a marriage be on equal legal footing. This bill is definitely an improvement under current law, but I would even go further to just set a bright line at 18, and maybe someday we will get there for our state. But for right now, I encourage your favorable consideration of House Bill 228, and I yield the well.
You have a question if you care to yield.
I will.
Chair recognizes Chairman Setzler to your right for a question.
Does Jim yield?
Yes, sir.
I appreciate your advocacy on this, and this is, I think we would all recognize, a very difficult subject. I am sensitive, though, particularly in the provision about the 4-year separation in age. I know in a criminal context, as we've looked at this and what we've called the Romeo and Juliet clauses, it really becomes a 4 years to the day threshold. So my question is, if you had of course, the age of consent, isn't it true, is 16 here in Georgia for consensual sex? Isn't that true?
Yes.
And I think none of us here would encourage that. But if there were a relationship between people where there was a 17-year-old and a 21-year-old, and the 21-year-old were, instead of being 48 months older, they were 51, 52 months older. They were maybe a birthday in June versus a birthday in February, a 17 and 21. There's no provision, even here as I read, that even the parents could allow the 17-year-old to marry the 21-year-old if they were perhaps pregnant with child. Why don't we have a provision to allow parents to allow that to happen in that circumstance?
Well, they can get married, they just can't get married until they're old enough to do so. And so we're taking a public policy stance recognizing that children are children. And there's a lot of research now that shows that full understanding in terms of the brains in both males and females doesn't really happen until the 20s. And so we want to give not the parents the most protection, we want to give the children the most protection, and I think that this bill does that. And you have to draw the line somewhere, and I think that 4 years is a reasonable time period, and what that is driving at is to prohibit circumstances where the male may be 20 years old, 30 years old, and it's really a coercive marriage and one that's not entered into voluntarily.
I appreciate the gentleman's consent, and there's no doubt about the gentleman's intentions here, and I think we all share the same intention. I just would pause when we think about a hard prohibition against a marriage, even when everybody's in agreement, even when it's a healthy marriage and parents would agree. The hard 4-year, 48-month provision, I think takes more study. And although I share the gentleman's concerns, I am concerned about how we as a General Assembly could preclude that from ever happening, even in a very healthy relationship that perhaps had a shared child.
You have additional questions if you care to yield.
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Erica Thomas to your left for a question.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Is it true that this measure is to help children in the state of Georgia and to make sure they are not in forced marriages?
Yes, it is.
And is it not further true that this measure passed unanimously out of committee?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Thank you so much for this matter.
Do you further yield?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Hutchinson to your right for a question.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Isn't it true that in the state of Georgia, a 16-year-old is taught in sex education abstinence first?
If the lady so states.
Isn't it further true that in the state of Georgia, we're not in the statute allowed to teach medically accurate information to a 16-year-old in the state of Georgia?
If the lady so states.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
You have no further questions.
Thank you, sir. I yield the well and ask favorable consideration on House Bill 228.